This is an account of the socialist and communist leader Charles Rutherford. He later described what happened. When the head of the line was within a block of the public square, the first trouble occurred. An officer in the uniform of the Red Cross jumped from a Victory loan truck, this is World War I stuff, and endeavored to take a red flag which a soldier in uniform was carrying at the head of the procession. A scuffle followed in which other soldiers from the truck and some businessmen joined in. During the scuffle, one of these businessmen drew a revolver and wildly threatened the workers in the procession. In 5 minutes, however, the struggle was over. The lieutenant and his supporters were driven back to the sidewalk and the head of the line reformed, with the red flag still flying. And they marched on to Public Square. Suddenly, the police made their appearance, and bad things happened. In the end, a battle ensued, and 2 marchers were killed, and hundreds were injured, and about 150 people were arrested. Again, this is 1919. There were a number of other events that occurred. There was a general strike in Seattle. It involved over 65,000 workers. That was in February of 1919. The workers in Seattle, they took over the police functions. They figured out how to do it themselves. It was returning soldiers from World War I did it. They basically ran the town for a few days. They provided meals, and strikers were paid, were given pay so they could buy the meals, and they basically took over functioning of the city. Let's see, Major General John Morrison, stationed in Seattle, claimed he had never seen, quote, a city so quiet and orderly.
There you go.
There were also, eventually it was suppressed, of course,
Right.
and but it wasn't the only. There were strikes in coal and I believe steel, and strike waves all over the country. Keep in mind that over half of the workers in industry at this time were immigrants, and they contributed to this strike wave that happened. There were also a series of bombings that occurred in the summer of 1919, directed at the various representatives of the capitalist establishment. In addition to the Cleveland May Day demonstrations all around the country were huge, and they were met with violence and police repression. In addition, in more than 24 communities, mostly urban and industrial areas, racial violence erupted in this late summer and fall of 1919. And unlike earlier such incidents in American history, these racial clashes were some of the first where African Americans responded with resistance to attacks by whites. Two of the most violent clashes occurred in Chicago and Washington, D.C. In D.C., gangs of whites attacked blacks, and police refused to intervene. But African Americans fought back. In the end, 10 whites were dead, including 2 police officers, and 5 African Americans died. In Chicago, wasn't quite as good. The violence lasted for 13 days, leaving 23 African Americans dead, along with 15 whites, and 1,000 black families were left homeless. The New York Times wrote of the events in Chicago, quote, "The violence resulted from an agitation which involves IWW, Bolshevism, and the worst features of other extreme radical movements," end quote. There were copies of Negro publications that called for alliances with leftist groups, praised the Soviet regime, and contrasted the courage of jailed socialist Eugene V. Debs with the schoolboy rhetoric of traditional black leaders. The Times characterized the publications as vicious and apparently well-financed, and mentioned certain factions of the radical socialist elements. The New York Times reported this under the headlines, "Reds try to stir Negroes to revolt." So 1919 was very tumultuous year for working people in this country. It came on the heels of the Russian Revolution, and it was immediately met with by something called the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids, they resulted in the deportation of hundreds of workers, and this repression actually went beyond the Palmer Raids and continued for several years, and we now know it as the Red Scare. Debs ran for re-election in 1920 while he was in prison in Atlanta, Georgia, at the federal penitentiary there. And incredibly, he was a write-in candidate. He received over 900,000 votes, which was 3.4% of the total votes cast. That pretty much ends the discussion, presentation on the Socialist Party. With the victory of the Russian Revolution, the Socialist Party ended up splitting into pieces. The left wing ended up forming, the left wing along with other elements ended up forming what eventually became the Communist Party of the United States. And remnants, Debs stayed with the Socialist Party, and I don't understand that because he really did not fit in there very well. But the Socialist Party exists today. I'm not sure what their politics are, but the movement goes on. We've learned a lot since the early 1900s. Hopefully no leftist group will ever make the mistake of the right wing and the center in the Socialist Party. They're actually a disgrace to our history, but they've been vanquished, and hopefully they'll never emerge again. One other thing, I used to be in the Socialist Party.
It's all right, it's all right.
I was in college at the time. I was in something called the Debs Caucus. We all liked Debs, and we were expelled. We were expelled for several reasons. We supported the Cuban Revolution.
Wow.
We supported the Angolan Revolution.
All right.
The revolutions in Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique. We have supported affirmative action, and we supported, of course, as I said, Cuba. So we were called Leninists, and we had a caucus of 7 or 8. There was only 7 or 8 of us. Most of us were from Ann Arbor, and I had never read Lenin. So I said, well, I better check this dude out. And sure enough, they were right. I was a Leninist. But I don't know what the party does today, but they were rotten when I got kicked out, which was about 30 years ago.